Hello, biology students. We are going to continue talking about the patterns of inheritance with our level 3 tutorial video, which is going to focus on pedigrees today. So if you've never heard of what a pedigree is before, simply just think of it as like a big family tree. So it shows you the relationships within a family and kind of shows how we would kind of go ahead and follow a specific trait through the different generations. So we will have to determine what the mode of inheritance is, which is just talking about whether or not this is a dominant or recessive trait. So the etiquette behind a pedigree is to kind of understand what you're seeing is the different shapes represent the biological sex. So when you see a circle, we are saying that person is a biological female. When we see a square, that is a biological male. So, how we identify the trait that we are tracking is when we see somebody who is shaded in, we say that individual is affected by whatever trait we're focusing on. So, if they are unshaded, like these two individuals right here, we are saying they do not have the specific trait we're looking at. In pedigrees, we also have different relationships. So, some of the things I want to point out too is in between, when we have a line like this between two individuals, we are saying that is ultimately like a marriage, a relationship line. From that, we'll see kind of like this line of descent that goes ahead and represents then that is their offspring. So, this represents that these two individuals are siblings. And then off to the left, we always categorize the generations by a Roman numeral. So this is what we would call generation 1 versus down here we would call this generation 2. So we are in this video going to focus on autosomal traits. Later on in a different video we'll talk about sex-linked pedigrees, but we haven't covered that type of cross yet. So just remember, when we're saying an autosomal trait, we're just saying that this gene falls somewhere on chromosome 1 through 22 because those are our autosomes. So in this example, we are looking at an autosomal recessive trait. So the trait we are tracking is recessive. So in order to be the recessive trait, remember you need two recessive alleles for that trait to be expressed. So we're saying somebody who would be affected is ultimately homozygous recessive. So I am going to kind of show you with this example how we'd go ahead and label everything within a pedigree like you will have to do. So first step is we always want to include the generations. So we have only 2 generations in this case. We represent that with a Roman numeral. So generation 1 is right here. This will represent generation 2. We also label the individuals like 1 through whatever it goes up to. So not a lot of individuals in each of these generations. So we just label them across. So we always start with the person on the left, which will be individual 1, the next person individual 2, so on and so forth. So we go ahead and fill that out. There's only 2 individuals in each generation. So with this now, we can go ahead and determine traits. So please understand, with autosomal traits, we don't have to focus on the individual's biological sex to determine their trait. So we can see in this case, our circles, remember, are females, our squares are our males, but that's not going to impact how we determine who's affected. So we said, in this case, since it's autosomal recessive trait we're tracking, those who are shaded have to be homozygous recessive. So our individual, who we would say generation 2, individual 1, is our only person we would mark with 2 recessive alleles. So we're going to use A's in this case. So they would have 2 lowercase a's. So from this information, we can actually determine other people's genotypes. So in this case, we can determine actually what their parents' genotypes are. So both of their parents are unshaded, which means that they have the dominant trait in this case. However, in order to have a child who is homozygous recessive, that means each parent actually has to be heterozygous. So we're going to fill them both in as heterozygous individuals, because that means both of them, with the law of segregation of alleles, remember, passes on that lowercase a to their first child in this case. That's how they end up being an effective individual for their recessive trait. So their second child, though, their son in this case, we actually don't have enough information to determine what their genotype is. We definitely know that they phenotypically are expressing the dominant trait. However, it could be two possibilities. They could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, just because they haven't gone off to have kids yet, or maybe there's not more context in the question. We can't actually determine that. So it's actually okay to write both of those genotypes in for this particular example. So going ahead, let's do the same thing, but now let's focus on an autosomal dominant trait. So autosome, still focusing on chromosomes 1 through 22. However, this time the trait we're tracking is the dominant trait, which means you only need one of those dominant alleles in order for the person to be impacted, aka affected. So all of our shaded individuals at least have one dominant allele in this case. So if we were to go ahead and complete this pedigree, we'd do the same thing. We'd label our generations. So we have 2 generations, 1 and 2. We'd number our individuals left to right. So 1, 2 in our first generation, 1, 2 in our second generation. So going ahead, since our shaded individuals have the dominant trait, that means everybody who is not shaded in has our recessive trait. Remember, the only way to be recessive is to have 2 recessive alleles. So it's really easy to figure out, okay, that must be the genotype of these 2 individuals. So going ahead now and kind of backtracking, we can figure out that each of these 2 individuals have to be heterozygous because, for example, if we were to go back, we can see, okay, because this person's a little a or 2 little a's, they're going to pass that on to their daughter in this case. But since this person has the dominant trait, that also means they inherited the dominant allele. Same thing with this parent. In order to have a child who is homozygous recessive, they'd have to pass on a little a, but again, they're shaded, so they have to have the dominant trait. So now what I want you to go ahead and do is, can you pause this video, and using this larger pedigree, I want you to use those skills we've just talked about to figure out what everybody's genotype would be in an autosomal recessive pedigree. So if you are ready to go ahead and check your work, here's ultimately the steps you should have followed. So we first off always want to label the generations. So we have 3 generations in this case. So we do that with that Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3. Then we number all of our individuals. We always start on the left, go across, and numerically increase. So our first generation has 4 individuals. Our second generation goes up to 7 individuals. And our third generation only has 2. So since this is an autosomal recessive pedigree, we always can know our shaded individuals and what their genotypes are. So our shaded individuals are homozygous recessive, which means they all have 2 recessive alleles. And now once we figured this out, we can kind of work around the pedigree to figure out, okay, what must other genotypes be? So the individuals we can figure out and kind of work backwards with are in generation 1, individuals 3 and 4, and in generation 2, 3 and 4 as well. So because each of these individuals had children who are homozygous recessive, that means they must all be heterozygous because they express the dominant trait, but they were able to have children with the recessive trait. The other individuals we can figure out from this information as well is individuals 1 and 2 in generation 2. Because they each have the dominant trait, we know that they have one dominant allele, but they have a father in this case who is homozygous recessive, so they both also have to be heterozygous. So then we're left with our 3 last individuals who all have the dominant trait, but with the context of the problem given, we can't actually determine if they're homozygous or heterozygous right now. So we could write both out just to represent we're not necessarily sure, but we definitely know that they have the dominant trait. So what I want you to do again is now you're going to do the same thing. Try this out on your own, but keep in mind this time it is a dominant trait. So go ahead, pause this video, try and solve all the things in the checkpoints to see if you can figure out what genotype everybody has. And then once you've attempted it, come back and check your work. So now that you're ready to check your work, first thing we want to start off with is labeling the generations. So we have 3 generations, 1, 2, 3. We number the individuals like we've said before, left to right. So generation 1 has 4 individuals, generation 2 has 5 individuals, and generation 3 has 3 individuals. So since this is a dominant trait, we are saying everybody who is shaded has the dominant trait. So I gave you that context. But if you were to have tried to figure this out on your own, you would have known this couldn't have been a recessive trait because 2 individuals who are recessive couldn't have had a child who was dominant. So this is kind of what gives away the idea that the shaded individuals in this case have the dominant trait. Because all of our unshaded individuals are recessive, they are all homozygous recessive. And from there, again, we can fill out different information. So every time you see somebody who is a child who is homozygous recessive, but their parents are shaded in this case, that must mean they are heterozygous because that's the only way to have offspring who has the genotype homozygous recessive. So here's kind of the parents we can fill in that are heterozygous. We also know that this individual right here is heterozygous because they're shaded, meaning they have the dominant trait. But since they have one parent who can only pass on a recessive allele, that's how that we knew they were heterozygous as well. So then our last 2 people in generation 2, because their parents are each heterozygous, we can't determine exactly what their genotype is. Because again, they could have inherited 2 dominant alleles, or they could have inherited a dominant and a recessive allele, making them heterozygous. So this is what we could fill in for now. The only way we could have solved this is if more information was given in this case. So this was our video on pedigrees. If you kind of need to go back and repeat anything, feel free to. But if you're feeling good about it, now it's your time to practice with some practice problems. Good luck.